Week 7, Day 3, Morning Nourishment. Lamentation 5:19. You, O Jehovah, abide forever. Your throne is from generation to generation. Psalm 45:6. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. Although Jeremiah was very human, he was also a man of God. He knew that the problems of the children of Israel could not be solved by merely being human. Therefore, at the end of the fifth lamentation, in Lamentations 5:19 through 22, he turned to Jehovah. The phrase "You, O Jehovah, abide forever" refers to God's eternal being, and it indicates that there is no change with Him. In the human realm, changes take place in every way. In particular, many things changed in the situation of the children of Israel. But there was no change with God's eternal being. He remains forever the same. God's throne has no beginning or end. His throne exists from generation to generation. Jeremiah's writing here concerning God's eternal being and His eternal, unchanging government surely is divine. In the third lamentation, Jeremiah spoke of God's loving kindness, compassion, and faithfulness, and at the end of the fifth lamentation, it appealed to God's eternal being and His eternal throne, His unchanging government. Which do you appreciate more and which do you consider higher? God's loving kindness, compassion, and faithfulness, or God's eternal being and eternal throne? God's eternal being and throne are higher than His loving kindness, compassion, and faithfulness. Today's reading. According to the New Testament, God's salvation is a matter of His love, His grace, and His righteousness. God's love and grace may change, but God's righteousness God's righteousness cannot change, because His righteousness is related to His government. Both love and grace are related to God's heart. God's heart may change, yet He would still be righteous. God's righteousness cannot change, because He must always be righteous. Jeremiah ended Lamentations not with God's loving kindness, compassion, and faithfulness, but with God's eternal being and His throne. This is a strong sign that in writing Lamentations, Jeremiah touched God's economy. Although his lamentations were too much in his human feeling, taste, love, and sympathy, at the end he came out of his being human and entered into God's divinity. There, in 5:19, he touched God's person and God's throne. In the New Jerusalem, God will be fully unveiled in His person and in His government, both of which are the unshakable foundation of His dealing with us. At the time, we will see God Himself as the eternal King with His eternal, unshakable kingdom. The divine title, Jehovah, means I am. He is the one who was, who is, and who will be forever. Jerusalem was finished, the temple was finished, and the land of Israel was finished. But Jehovah will never be finished. When Jeremiah's position and angle were changed from himself to Jehovah, he realized that although everything may be lost, Jehovah remains forever. The fact that nothing remains and that everything is finished manifests the truth that Jehovah remains forever. Heaven and earth may end, but he will never end. He is the unique source, and all the generations come out of him. I appreciate the contrast in Lamentations 5:18 and 19, for it shows us what remains and what does not remain. Eventually, every ism will come to an end, yet Jehovah will remain forever.